So this is really just building off of the report that I presented to the board in November 2021. The result of which was a recommendation that be brought back to a committee of the whole meeting for further in-depth discussion. But I wanted to present you with some updated data since then. So to begin with, I thought it would be smart to just remind everyone, walk them through exactly how the property tax system and the allocation of taxes works for the regional district. So there's really kind of three main cuts to it. So the first being setting the budget. That's the part we control. We can determine what the budget's going to look like, and based on that budget, how the total amount of property taxes that we need to collect. And that, of course, isn't one big pool of taxes. It's 115 or so different services, each with a different pattern of participants and who's paying the tax. And so it's really a cumulative number of those many different services, but that's the part we control. And then the next piece, generally set out in our service establishment bylaws, is the allocation for those areas participating in each service, allocation of those property taxes to each of those areas. And it's generally, for the most part, based on converted assessment, relative converted assessment. And then once you get it allocated to a particular area, the TNRD, we don't collect the property taxes ourselves, but the member municipalities collect them in their jurisdictions on our behalf, and the province collects it in the unincorporated areas for us. And they do the work of breaking it down. How much do we need to collect from the residential property class, from business, from utilities, and so on. And that I'm going to walk you through as well, just so you can see how it works. So here's the comparison, the 2021 assessment, the converted assessment. This is information I usually show you every year when I'm presenting the budget. So 2021 compared to the data we have so far for 2022. And you can see this would be based on a service if everyone in the TNRD were participating in it, like public libraries or film commission. And generally, the allocation of taxes is broken down based on.
Can't hear anything.
If I move the mic a little closer, does that help? Can you hear me now? Okay, I'll continue. So, it adds up to 100%. And what happens is each year as the assessment data is released, the relative proportions between the different areas shift slightly. So you can see in 2021, Kamloops, for example, the converted assessment works out to 64.448% of the total. In 2022, it's 64.522. So there's a slight increase, which means that if we were collecting the same amount of tax as we were in 2021, Kamloops would be paying just a little bit more. And so all the ones over on the right-hand column in black all saw a little bit of an increase in the proportion that they represent to the total. The ones in red represent a slight decrease. It's still going to work out to a net zero-sum game. It's still going to add up to 100%. So you can see, for example, Area P was one of the areas that had the largest.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes, Steve. Can you hear me, Steve?
Can you hear us from the boardroom, Steve?
Okay, I'll continue. So Area P at a 0.2% increase. They were 3.22% of the total in 2021. Now they're 3.422%. So they had one of the larger increases, which means, again, all the other things being equal, if we were collecting the same amount of tax, there'd be a little bit more allocated to Area P, a little bit less allocated to Area B, which had one of the larger decreases in their percentage. It always shifts a little bit every year. Which is why even if taxes stay flat, some areas will still see tax increases and other areas will see tax decreases. So the next cut, once you've allocated the taxes to a particular area, is to look at the breakdown. And if I go back one slide, you'll see City of Merritt for 2022, the converted assessments 188,761,776. So I'm taking that off this report I get from BC Assessment. And you can see it circled there in red where that converted assessment is, the breakdown for each property class. And you can see just to the right of it, the conversion amount. So you see the gross assessment under the column says total. Converted assessment for residential is 10% of the gross. For utilities, it's 35% of the gross and so on. Those are the percentages set by the province to get from gross assessment to converted assessment. So once I have that, this was an example, and I used Merritt simply because it was one of the larger shifts.
Can't hear anything. Still can't.
So in this chart, you'll see for the city of Merritt, for example, the gross assessment where it says actual value, the conversion percentages to get to converted assessment again. And then you see the breakdown where it says percentage share, what percentage each of those property classes represents of the converted assessment. So just like where we're allocating taxes to City of Kamloops or Area P or City of Merritt.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, Steve, it must be something on your end.
Okay.
Someone else on Zoom can hear. Dave just said maybe to try and turn up the volume.
So what you see here is the percentages on a percentage share that each property class represents of the total converted assessment in the city of Merritt. And for us, that's what drives how much tax we're going to collect from each class. So with the municipality, it works a little differently. With a municipality, they can play with that tax rate to kind of keep the proportionality the same. So if they're collecting just, for example, 60% of the property tax from residential and 40% from other classes, and the residential property values go up as they have been over the last few years, they can manipulate it a little bit so they can still keep that 60%, 40% proportionality. I don't have that ability because the rules are slightly different for regional districts. So for 2022, residential class represents 64.82% of the total converted assessment in the city of Merritt. So if I was collecting $1 million from the city of Merritt, and that's not the actual tax requisition, but that's a nice round figure to use for illustration purposes, I'd be collecting, or rather the city would be collecting on our behalf, $648,163 out of that million from the residential property owners. And I've also added in here, you can see the number of properties listed by the BC assessment reports, 3,055 residential properties. If I work out the average value of a residential class, which is really just taking the gross value divided by the number of properties, for 2022 works out to an average value of 400,485. And if I apply the class one tax rate, the average tax class one taxpayer would be paying in 2022 if we were collecting $1 million would be $212.18. Now in 2021, exact same, but if you look at the residential portion, it was 62.77% as opposed to 64.82. So if taxes stayed flat, if we were still collecting $1 million the year before, residential would have been paying 627,677 out of the million, not 648. So there's an increase in the amount of tax that we would need to collect from residential, even though the total taxes we're collecting hasn't changed. And that's purely a mathematical result of the converted assessment calculation and the way that the property tax process has been created for us. I don't control any of that. So just as a reminder, you do the first cut there So some areas are going to see increases allocated to each area. And then they may also see increases if you're a residential taxpayer, because not only would the city of Merritt be allocated a larger amount of the tax, even if we didn't increase the tax, and then the residential taxpayers are paying a larger piece of that again. So it can be a bit of a double whammy there. This slide, and I'll hurry through this a little bit. This was just to kind of give you a bit of a snapshot of the change. It's about a 30% increase in residential converted assessment versus a less than 20% increase in the other classes. And that's what, you know, part of the point of these reports I've been preparing, put before the board is to help you understand how these market changes in property values are impacting the property taxes that they're having to pay. So again, snapshot of comparison. If I was collecting $1 million from the city of Merritt, 2021 versus 2022, more tax, roughly 20,486 more would be coming from the residential sector, and we'd be collecting less from most of the other property classes, a little bit more from major industries, it works out, but roughly, you know, half of that increase in residential is coming out of the utility class that's paying less and coming out of the business class that's paying less. Now, if I took the TNRD as a whole, if I get away from just using City of Merritt as an example, for this one, I basically said, here's the proportionality for the TNRD as a whole. And again, this isn't really accurate because we don't have one big service that everyone pays into. It's accumulation of many different services, some of which some municipalities pay into, others that they don't. But for illustrative purposes, I used the total tax requisition from 2021, excluding local services. So ones that generally most areas are paying into. And in 2021, for the TNRD as a whole, cumulatively, residential represented about 67% of the converted assessment. In 2022, it's closer to 70%. So if we were collecting exactly the same tax as in 2021, you can see there's, you know, a significant about 4% lift coming out of the residential sector and decreases in the other sectors. And again, I don't have any control over that. I set the budget, or you set the budget when you approve it. I make recommendations about what taxes we need to support the services. And the rest of this is a mathematical exercise to derive at who pays. And it's all designed to tax property values. And the trend in the last few years, and it's been accelerating in recent years, is the trend is that value is all concentrating into the residential property class. So I think we had a question.
Yeah, Director Schaefer.
Could you please explain to me, okay, now that we've had the floods and all the disasters we've had, are these assessments based, including that, taking that into account, or are these assessments based on as if they have a house and everything still?
So these 2022 assessment data that I'm giving you is based on what they call a completed roll, which is released in January. Then BC assessment goes through an appeals process in February. And at the end of March, they release what they call the revised roll, which takes into account any appeals. What I understand from what BC assessment has said publicly is the completed roll that was published in January, they did their best to take into account changes in property classes that were adversely affected because of the wildfires, because they still had a little bit of time to deal with that. They usually are setting their values as of work they've done in, you know, by July. But when there's significant events in July and August, they'll do their best to try and take that into account. The floods happened so late in the year. My understanding is that this data that I have doesn't take any of that into account yet. And what they're doing is saying, if you believe your property values are overvalued now that you've had flood damage, go through the appeals process to present information to BC assessment in February, have them look at that and revalue your property. So that should be reflected in the revised roll that I don't have yet. It's not released yet. It'll come out, actually, it never comes out before the budget comes before the board. But I do take that into account with the actual tax requisitions. So I present the information to the board based on the data I have available. And legislatively, the board is required to adopt a budget before the end of March. Usually the revised roll comes out just the tail end, the very last few days of March. I update all of my calculations to take that into account before we send out the tax requisitions to the municipalities or to the province. So it would be taken into account with the final tax requisition this year, as long as it went through the appeals process.
So in the end, it could affect our taxes. So they could go up.
It could,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
For the whole area.
Well, if you think about that whole cut of allocating taxes to the various areas of the TNRD, if one area goes down significantly, and I can give you an example if I backtrack here a couple of slides. Village of Lytton, you see, has a decrease. That's because the fires were taken into account with their property values. So part of what you see with those changes is, some of that increase or decrease, some of that is property values increasing in some areas, and therefore pulling taxes, migrating taxes away from other areas towards them. Typically in the past, as Sun Peaks has grown faster than the rest of the TNRD, you've seen existing taxes migrate to Sun Peaks, where they're now responsible for paying them. But the reverse can be true too. So if there's an area that has a decrease in property values, some of that responsibility for the taxes migrates back to the other areas, because it's really based on the proportionate amount of the total column, right? Does that answer your question? Yeah. So it's not really set in stone until the budget's adopted and that revised roll gets taken into account. And even then, the following year, I get a final tally of any other adjustments that might have been made even after taxes were requisitioned. And if there's any significant changes with what the final tally for 2021 was, we can make adjustments to the 2023 taxes to account for that, to make sure everything's been fairly done.
Director Christopherson.
Yeah, just a question regarding making your appeals. That's always done in January, and in Merritt's case, most of those people weren't even there. It's too late for them to appeal now, is it not? So
I'm not sure the exact deadlines the BC assessment has. And
usually it's by the end of January, and a lot of people still had no idea what was happening. So
yeah,
my question is, it's probably too late it's too late for individuals to appeal, but is there still the opportunity for the city to make that case that we still don't know what the property extent is?
yeah. And unfortunately, that's really a question for BC assessment. I don't have an answer for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But was it dependent on individuals appealing?
If they
City
wanted to
can't do
take
it.
it into account for the 2022 taxes, that would be the only opportunity they'd really have to provide that information to BC assessment, because BC assessments work on doing their own assessments that had already been completed. And it was too late in the year for them to go out and do more work and meet their deadlines.
So we'll have to handle it a different way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'll try to quickly finish this up to leave room for discussion, but this is just some updated information. Then chart I've shown you in the past, you can see between 2021 and 2022. This represents, again, the proportion, the percentage on the left-hand axis there of the total converted assessment in the TNRD that's represented by residential class 1, a longer term trend. So you can see from 2010 on, it dipped a little bit, but it's been climbing, and between 2021 and 2022, it's getting even more steep. This is the cumulative change since 2015. If you look back at this one, 2015 is kind of where it bottomed out and started to climb again. So cumulatively, the converted value for residential has increased about 94% between 2015 and 2022. And the percentages are a little bit misleading because you can see you can have a high percentage for a low number, like managed forest, they're class 7, 88% increase, but it's only $113,000. So it's really insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Business, which is the second most, largest dollar value for converted assessment, only increased by 42%, or about half as much as residential. And clearly, the concentration of values in residential, and more every year. Here's the same information in a chart using dollar values rather than as a percentage. So again, just updating what I was presented in November, and you can see from 2021 to 2022, again, that upward curve has just gone into another vertical realm altogether. It's just, it's on a whole different level than it has been. There's been some increase, the second line down, the blue line is business class 6. You can see some increase there and a little bit of increase in the utility. But, clearly the majority of the value and more is concentrated in residential. So then you would look at that and say, okay, well, if you've got this big increase in residential and the assessed value, well, how much of that is new growth? How much of that is new construction? Because typically, if you're adding new properties to the mix, that has the impact of diluting the taxes. If you have, say 10 taxpayers in a service in 1 year and 12 the next year, then technically you could collect the same amount of tax, but everyone would pay a little bit less individually.
Mr. Ray, I think Director Rice has his hand raised.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And it was from back on the appeal process. I wanted to just make a note on Director Christopherson's concern. The deadline was the 31st of January. However, if you're impacted in your assessments, let the constituents know that if you're flood impacted, there's a special line, a special number to call. Jamie has that number, and the deadline for that assessment appeal has been extended to March 15th. So time is running out, just a couple of weeks or more. And but there is, for flood victims, if your assessment's been impacted, Jamie gave me the number and I passed it on because there's a few people down here, but I know it's a little late, but I was trying to get your attention to answer Director Christopherson's question. So they have made a provision for the assessments. It's a direct line for flood only impacted properties. Thank you.
Thanks for that information, Director Rice.
So in terms of new growth, certainly there has been some new growth during this period of time, but it's been fairly insignificant compared to just the increases in market values. So this chart shows the cumulative impacts of each. So the orange bars are the value increases since 2015 purely due to market forces. I get a report from BC Assessment each year that breaks it down. Here's the change in assessment for each area in each class. This is how much was what they call non-market change, which is generally new construction, but it could also be moving from one class to another or things of that nature, versus just basically increases in market value based on sales data they have. So clearly the orange greatly outweighs the blue. And so the impact has been pushing more and more of the taxes onto residential without that new growth to offset that necessarily. And just again, another update for another piece of information. This is the MLS home price index for Kamloops and district for a 2-story single family dwelling. So specific to the Kamloops and district area, this is their benchmark price, so dollar values, basically over the last 10 years from 2012 onward. And you can see it goes up and down a little bit. Frankly, by 2015, you're still at the same point really as you started in 2012, but it starts taking off from there. And you can see how steep it's getting. And even since the last time I showed you data in November, it's continuing to increase. That's the same chart, a little larger to make it easier to see. So, in terms of sales, this was just another snapshot from the Kamloops District Real Estate Association. They publish a sales performance stats press release. This is from January 2022. And this was really just something I showed you in November. This is just an update that kind of shows you the increase in the average prices that they're seeing through sales. And it's not just Kamloops, it's sort of throughout the area you see increases. And this is 21 compared to 2020 cumulative for the year. So it might not necessarily take into account in Merritton area, for example, if there was a downturn right at the end of the year. But just to show you, there's been increases across the board throughout the regional district, really. So short-term versus longer-term trend, since 2015, most residential taxpayers have actually seen annual taxes decrease on average, unless new services were added. Despite the growing values and despite the migration of the taxes to the residential sector. And that's because the TNRD since 2015 has generally consistently been lowering the taxes in total that we're collecting, as we've seen cost savings, mainly in the area of solid waste. You recall we entered into some 5-year contracts for operations and stuff that had a lower cost to us than previously. Well, we've paid that on to the taxpayer by lowering taxes rather than just putting it into our reserves. But now the trend is reversing. Our costs are beginning to grow again, and the taxes are needed to support them properly, which means, expectation, and you saw that with the provisional budget in December, an expected increase in property taxes compared to 2021. But if we look at it, slightly longer term, there's the red bar at the top. That's the property taxes in total that we collected in 2015. If we just left it there flat through to 2022, that's what we would have collected. The blue bar represents what we actually collected. So generally consistently, between 2015 and 2021, it works out to about $1.3 million less that we were collecting in 2021 than we were in 2015. The 2022 figures from the provisional budget, because I don't have a final figure yet for the final budget that's coming next month, but you can, and I expect it to be a little bit less than that. But you can see it's kind of reversing, but we're still lower than we were in 2015 or 2016. The number of services has generally stayed fairly consistent during this period, although there's been some additional local services added. And I'm thinking of like the 5 fire departments we took over in 2019 were added, but even then our tax requisition was down lower than it was previous to that.
Director Elliott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Where in this requisition thing do you add debt load?
Well, generally, those are collected by parcel taxes. This is property taxes, and parcel taxes work differently.
Well, yes, I'm aware of parcel
Yeah.
taxes, but do we have a debt load that would be required just on property taxes, other than maybe the hospital?
No, all of our debt is currently held in some of our utility services for water services. And so that debt is being paid each year. We collect parcel taxes from the residents just in that utility service. So yes, there is a bit of a tax increase for those particular properties where they're paying additional parcel taxes they weren't paying before.
But the overall is not.
Yeah, we don't
carrying-
collect property taxes, and there's no debt on any of our general services outside of utilities.
Okay, thank you.
However, we have been drawing down our reserves quite significantly. So cumulative impact, this is just a quick slide. If we'd left our taxes flat from what we were collecting in 2015 and just put the difference into reserves, into savings, rather than passing it on to the taxpayer, we would have almost $4.5 million more in the bank than we do today. So that's money that the taxpayers have instead of us. And just again, a bit of a longer term snapshot. When I bring the budget to you, I usually show a calculation that shows for each area what the average residential value is and what the average taxes are and what the change is this year compared to last year. And I wanted to update a little bit, give you a bit of that longer term trend. So not only have the total taxes we're collecting gone down, but looking at the residential sector in particular, many of the areas have seen decreases in the taxes that those residential taxpayers are paying. And why is that? Because even though the value has been migrating and concentrating more and more in residential, we've lowered our taxes sufficiently to offset that up until this point. And some of that, again, is migration from one area to another. So if I look at this table, for instance, Kamloops, which doesn't participate and pay into our solid waste management service, wouldn't have benefited from any cost savings that we reduced those budgets by. In 2015, and this is again a very simple calculation, what's the total gross assessment for the class 1 sector that BC Assessment gives me, divided by the number of properties they give me. The average value in 2015 was 339,432. Now, and I'm using 2021 simply because I don't have really the taxes calculated yet for 2022. But just looking at 2021, the average value was 480,642. So it increased about 42%. The average taxes paid by the average valued property in Kamloops in 2015 was about $125. This is just TNRD taxes, not municipal taxes or provincial taxes. $125. Now in 2021, it was about $134. So an increase of about $9 over 6 years, which works out on average to about 1.2% increase per year. So basically lower than inflation. Sun Peaks, on the other hand, had a much larger increase percentage-wise in the average value of their properties. And their property taxes increased from about 372 in 2015 to 445 in 2021. So that works out to about 3.29% per year. Well, some of that is because, and keeping in mind, by 2021, we'd significantly lowered the taxes we were collecting. So some of that is taxes migrating from Barrier or Clearwater or Merritt or what have you to Sun Peaks as they took on a larger piece of the total converted assessment for the TNRD. But many areas between the lowering of taxes in total and some of that migration saw a decrease in their taxes since 2015. And if you look at the electoral areas, it's much the same. The outlier there really is Area N. And when I looked at that previously, there were 1 or 2 new services added in. So that increase in taxes really was paying for services in 2021 that they weren't paying for in 2020, or in 2015. So if we're just looking at it over a slightly longer trend, and my fear is if we just look at, 2022, when it comes to you versus 2021, it's going to look like a steep increase. But if we look at it over the longer trend, even with that increase, there's still going to be some areas that are paying less than they were in 2015 on average. And there's a real and growing need to increase taxes to fund the TNRD services properly. Our infrastructure is aging. We need to do more work to, even this building, it needs a new roof. We've got, proposed project that's going to cost about $350,000 for a new chiller as part of our heating and cooling system. There's demand for more infrastructure. We've been looking at a new library branch. There's rebuilding the library in Lytton, repairs and renovations to this building, fire halls.
Director Watson?
Thank you. Have we already started paying more taxes for the new library? The proposed new library?
No,
Thank you.
no, that's still in the planning. Right now, what we have is a little bit of money in their reserves that in the budget has been allowed for looking at acquiring a piece of land, the initial planning costs to get us to a point where we might be prepared to apply for grants, things of that nature. But frankly, we don't have the money in the bank for it. Moving forward with that project's going to be absolutely contingent on us receiving some significant government grants. And to leverage those grants, we'd have to go out to the people and ask for permission to borrow money. And until we borrow that money and construct the library, we wouldn't be collecting taxes to pay for that debt.
Thank you.
And the people haven't had a chance to have a word on that yet.
Director Roden.
Have we still got money in the bank to do the proposed renovations at the Ashcroft branch, which still haven't started?
Yes, that's still, it was built into the 2021 budget. And so that money is being rolled forward into the 2022 budget to make sure that project happens. But my point is, as our infrastructure age, it requires money to bring it, up to modern standards. And there's, demands for new infrastructure. And once you add more stuff, that costs more money. We have a government grant that's going to pay 100% for a new water treatment plant in Pritchard. But once we have a new water treatment plant in Pritchard, we need staff to operate it. We need, to pay for heating and electricity and all those things that we're not incurring now. And there's rising workloads demanding additional staff resources. And I'd like to personally say thank you very much for supporting the additional staff position yesterday for finance, because it's not a short-term need. It truly is a long-term need. And as I said, we've been draining our savings. We have an operating reserve in our general administration that at the beginning of 2020 was about 2.2 million. I predict by the end of this year, it's going to be closer to 600,000. Most of the money we have in our library reserves is dedicated to, again, just the preliminary look at acquiring land for another branch and planning. The only other reserve we have with any substantial money in it is the solid waste management reserve, which we've got a financial plan to draw down over roughly a 10-year period to about half of what it is today. So most of it's already spoken for. When it comes to, running an EOC in the summer, when we have fires and floods, we get
Director Duty.
reimbursed. Maybe I'll just finish my thought. We get reimbursed from EMBC for those costs, but we front the cash flow until we get reimbursed. So where's that cash coming from? It's from these reserves.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. A. My understanding is with operating reserves, you should be running at a level of between 12 to 25% to be comfortable for future needs. Now, given that you said that we depleted them to the extent that we have, what percentage are we sitting at and what are we going to do to try to recover those?
Well, the percentage, I haven't calculated it precisely, but it's much lower than that. Last time I calculated it is when it was about the 2.2 million mark. And there's no real sort of specific guidance or benchmark for where your reserves should be. GFOA years ago published a best practice that suggests just for contingencies, you should be looking at least 2 months of your annual operating budget, which works out to about 16%. And last time I looked at what we had in sort of general administration, it was about 16%. And now we're looking at, we have less than a third of that. So part of the need is to regrow those reserves so that we've got adequate contingency and setting ourselves up for future needs. The only way for us to do that is one of two ways: cut costs or increase taxes. And we've been cutting costs, and I don't foresee us having a lot of wiggle room to keep doing that.
Director Quinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe time to float an idea. From the information that Mr. A has presented, we're going to need to put taxes up somewhere over the next 2 to 3 years. Is that better? Okay, thank you. I'm just wondering if it's not a good idea. I think we have to go out to the people every once in a while to tell them, to get input from them. Maybe it's time to go out to our communities and ask them the question is, what do regional districts do? What do they do? And what do you want them to do? And get some feedback and build a budget on that, including building reserves. And we have a penchant here, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Every time a new thing comes along, we jump on it, and that costs money. And I would like us to be able to get some input from communities on, from that perspective, are we doing the right thing? Do you want less? And get some feedback from communities. And I have no problem going out to them and asking that. And I'm just wondering how such an idea would float. And to Mr. Ray is, could we do that this summer?
That is actually one of the number one things on my priority list, that and, addressing the policy improvements and such that came out of the BDO report. And that was one of the number one needs identified for that new position in finance is, frankly, I truly believe we need to do more public consultation around the budget. It's been a resource issue, and along with COVID and that sort of thing in recent years. And that's one of the chief things I identified, that having that extra position with finance, a more high-level management level position, would be someone who, rather than me trying to do some of that off the side of my desk, we could have someone who could have some dedicated time to that.
I like to, it's just an idea I'm floating, and this is obviously a reasonably good place to make that suggestion. And I wouldn't mind hearing some feedback from other directors on, is that a direction we should go? Thank you.
Thank you, Director Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it was 2 years ago that Doug and I sat in this boardroom for some 3-4 hours expecting people to come and tell us what they thought of the budget. We got one person. And so I'm thinking that if you're going to do that kind of thing, it's going to have to be in the communities that have a vested interest in what happens within their community, not just a global.
Director Rothenberger.
Thanks, Chair. I agree with both with what Director Quinn and Director Elliott have said. I think it's an excellent idea to do that. I also know, as Director Elliott has said, that in the past we've tried, but the way we've tried it is to centralize it here and expect people to come in. And the reason we've done that is just we haven't had the resources to go out into the communities, because you look at all the various communities and that we would go to, it would take a tremendous amount of time and resources. If we can figure out a way of doing that, then absolutely we should do that. It's been a deficiency, I think, in our budget process for a long time, not because we wanted it that way, but because that's the way it had to be. So possibly the new finance position will help with that, and we can get something going, because it'd be terrific if we could.
Mr. Ray, did you want to comment before Director Schaefer?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, it's actually a requirement that we do public consultation for our budget. And I can point out, a number of things that we have relied upon to meet that requirement in the past. When we've updated our solid waste management plan, that's a 10-year plan, and there was a lot of work put into public consultation around that. Well, that's about a third of our budget. In the past, there's been public consultation around our library services, fire departments, utilities, but it tends to be kind of looking at a service and not the budget as a whole. And one of the ways I'm planning to help address some of what we're talking about is making more use of our new communications department and social media. And it's a matter of kind of putting together some content and trying to engage people. And certainly some meetings in communities it's probably timely to do that as well. But I think that we've got some tools at our disposal that we can do more outreach than we could before, and we should be doing that without necessarily it being as problematic as it was in the past. But it still takes time to create content and engage.
Thank you. I have Director Schaefer, Director Rain, and Director Quinn. Director Schaefer?
I would just like to say that I think it's a great idea to come to the communities, but when you get into, like in my area, I've got 5 different little sets of communities, and most times when the regional district comes, they go to Clearwater and expect everybody to come into Clearwater. Well, the people in my region don't think they should have to go to Clearwater. Like if you want to talk to us, come to Vaden, come to Birch Island, come to Blackpool and all those places, you know, which is going to be costly. But I think it's an excellent idea.
Thank you, Director Rain.
Yeah, thank you. I did want to kind of follow up from Director Duty's conversation, but given the subject right now, I would say that you certainly can use surveys. Our community, we've used Survey Monkey to good effect, and we've had high participation rates. So that might be an easier way to get feedback. The issue I wanted to really talk about was this whole issue of the increases in the budget. I mean, the budget is going to go up by, or the amount of revenue collected from tax requisitions is proposed to go up over $1 million. So it's about 4.5% increase. That's a substantial amount. I noted that in the November 18th report, there was language that said future tax increases will depend on the level of reserves achieved, service level adjustments, and the amount of new growth. And well, Mr. Ray has spoken to those just recently. I think it's incumbent upon us to receive a report prior to the approval of the budget that shows us exactly the detailed analysis for each reserve account balance and the forecast of anticipated needs over the next 5 years. It's great to talk. I mean, it's interesting. The report's full. We've drained the reserves. There's language in there recklessly reducing taxes. You know, even this dilution that Mr. Ray speaks about. When we have new growth, we're not diluting a taxpayer's taxes. We are lowering their proportion of the total taxes because there are new people joining it. But I just find some of the language we have here is all kind of saying like the taxpayers should expect to pay, just expect to pay. We need to look at the detailed analysis of these reserve accounts. We need to look at the services that we're providing and where those services are going to go up above an inflationary increase with an explanation of why and how. Then this board can make a proper decision as to how much money should be collected from taxpayers next year. I really do object to this idea that taxes just have to go up. Taxes have to go up. Yeah, we were able to lower taxes because of the costs of the solid waste systems went down, but all of a sudden we say, well, we lowered people's taxes. Now we got to raise them. We don't have to raise anybody's taxes unless we have services that people are going to find to be worthwhile, or we're in a financial situation where we can't support the activities we're doing. But we haven't seen that. I mean, this is a great detailed explanation of how the system works, and I appreciate that explanation. But the real crunch for us as directors is how much more money do we need to raise next year and why? And that I would hope that the board would want to see a presentation on those details before we approve a budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Rain. Did you wish to comment on that, Mr. Ray, or not?
Well, I guess the point that I'm trying to get across here, I don't disagree, but I'm trying to help directors understand what the market forces at play are that are driving taxes. It's not necessarily a question of raising or lowering taxes in total. It's the fact that even if taxes stayed flat, residential taxpayers, because of the way this collection system operates, end up having more of the tax burden on them. And that's a mathematical reality, really. And that's what I hope to get across. So when it comes to, that, and I am saying that, as I'm developing the 2022 budget, I do see, lower surpluses to fund, carry forward money to spend in 2022, increases in costs. Our payroll goes up every year. We have collective agreements that dictate that. We have, last year, 4 additional staff that the board approved, and those taxes are coming into play this year. There are real increases in costs, and less money in the bank at the beginning of the year than we've had previously.
Supplementary, if I may, that's all great, but it still comes down to the biggest factor that would change all of this is how much money are we going to requisition taxpayers for? And that's the issue. We've gone into unbelievable detail on how this all changes with the changing real estate prices. I'd just like to see the same kind of detail on our reserve accounts, our forecasted anticipated needs from those reserve accounts over the next few years, and the service level increases. We need that same analysis so that we can make a proper decision on a budget. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Rain. I have Director Quinn, Director Watson, Director Smith, Director Polderman, and Director Christian. So Director Quinn.
Thank you. I just wanted to float it as an idea, and it seems to have generated some discussion, which is great. I still think that we should be in some way having a chat with our taxpayers on what the necessities of increasing taxes are. The easiest way, of course, to lower taxes is to dump services. Some of them we can't, some we can adjust, some we could get rid of. And that's kind of the idea I was having a look at is, let's make sure people know this is why your tax bill is X number of dollars, because you want this service or that service or the other service, along with the fact these are the services we have to provide under provincial legislation. And that was all. I'm glad it's generated some discussion, and I look forward to see where we're going from there. Thank you. And what Director Rain's comment about survey monies, I'm not talking about having a meeting in every single community in the regional district. That's not practical. But part of the reason that we don't get turnout at those meetings is because we centralized it here. As Director Elliott said, only one person showed up. Well, nobody's going to come in from Spence's Bridge or Lytton or Blue River or Clearwater or up in the Clinton area for that kind of a meeting, but they might participate in the survey or attend a local meeting up there. That was where I was going with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Watson.
Thank you. Kind of a two-parter. Last night, the Village of Lytton had a town hall meeting online. Director Polderman, did that work out? And if it does, couldn't we do town hall meetings online?
Whether it worked out or not, I'm yet to find out. We've been having them. Many of the people that you saw on that town hall were actually not from the Village of Lytton.
Director Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this might be kind of more of a general question for people that have a little bit more history. My question is there anybody that knows when the last time BC Assessments actually reviewed their own assessment structure? And one of the reasons that I asked that question is because the District of Logan Lake actually sent a resolution to UBCM last year I believe it was, asking them to do that review because there was an organization that came to us requesting land to put in, actually it was windmills. And their question was about energy efficient projects and what tax structure was around those types of projects. So I'm just asking the question because I think it might be timely for assessments, BC assessments themselves to even do some sort of a review if that hasn't been done anytime in the last while.
Mr. Ray?
I don't have an answer to that. I do know even if you just look at those conversion percentages, those were set by the province, how we get from gross assessment, converted assessment. They were set decades ago and they haven't changed. So I don't know about the inner workings of BC assessment, but in terms of how this tax process and the mathematical aspects of it hasn't changed in decades.
Thanks, Director Polderman.
We're talking about going out to our taxpayers, and while we may not be able to go to every community in 1 year, maybe we could visit every community over a number of years. And I think a really vital part of that visit would be to explain what services the TNRD actually provides. And we should seek a response on what services they want. But I don't think the question of whether taxes need to go up or down is a question for the taxpayer, because I've never met a taxpayer who's told me that their taxes need to go up.
Thanks, Director Polderman.
And
I think we all share that experience.
Yeah. Maybe I can just quickly support you on that. I think the idea would be to ask them, talk to them about the services they're receiving and whether they're happy with them. Whether they think that they're too expensive and are there areas that we could cut to lower taxes, or if they're happy with them and they feel that the cost is appropriate. That's generally the tact I've seen other local governments follow. It's more a question of, satisfaction with the service level. Do you want the service level to increase? Would you like more service or would you like less service? And if you know more service is going to come at a higher price, what's more important to you?
Thank you, Director Christian.
Thank you, Chair Gillis. I guess first of all, I'm looking at my screen and I see Director Blackwell's hand is a different color than mine. Mine appears to be yellow, which I'm hoping is not a jaundice issue, but anyway, just an observation. I want to circle back to Director Rain and his questions about the rationale for any increases. And I think part of Doug's response really twigged something in my mind, and that is throughout the course of the year, we make decisions as a board which have an impact in a subsequent year's tax rate, but we forget about it. And I think it would be helpful for the budget document to include those additional tax measures that we have made by virtue of recommendations that we have supported. And in some cases, we add a staff member, but they don't come for, part of the year. So it's just a little bit in the year we do it. And then the following year, it's kind of a wallop and we forget that we actually had approved that 15 months ago. So I think that that would help us, I think, rationalize in our own mind that we make some decisions and there are some consequences of these decisions down the road. And I guess my final point would be to Director Polderman's suggestion about, making a tour of the region. And at one time, prior to all of the latest controversy, we used to go out I thought every year or two, member municipalities in particular, and provide an update about the service levels provided by the regional district, and sort of a meet and greet with the staff in those municipalities. And I think that was a good practice, and I would hope that after we get back on track, we would continue to do that. And part of that, of course, would be a budget update.
Thanks, Director Christian, and I think that's a good suggestion. I think it was COVID probably that interfered with that program. I have Director Blackwell and then Director Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As to Director Christian, the reason that your hand is yellow is between you and your liver. That's your conversation. 2 points. On topic, Mr. Ray, I absolutely agree with your position on reserves. I think, as pointed out last time you did an update on this, that needs to be addressed. I don't think we have enough spare fuel in the tank to do the things that we need to do. I don't see that as additional acts for taxation. That's just restoring what should have been there previously, and Clearwater's in the same position. Second, on consultation, Clearwater does that a couple different ways, combined Zoom and in-person meetings with basically what Doug is doing right now for the public. We get more interest for the cheese, crackers, and free fruit that the 7 citizens get to take home, and the councillors get to take home at those meetings within our own town than we do from the public. I still see it as a required thing that we need to do, but it does not get you any sort of fair sample of the public feelings on taxation. The only time we've broken from that is when we combine it with something else, which is something that is either controversial, like a water park, or an expansion to our sports facility. Sports facilities are usually really good because it attracts a lot of attention. Or do yourself a container bylaw, shipping container bylaw, and you'll get half the town out. And that's all I've got to say.
Thanks, Director Blackwell. Director Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just thought that I would like to lighten the load around here. I sat in a meeting in 1967 that said the government would now provide the rural areas of British Columbia with all the services that were required to keep them involved at the same level as the municipality. In 1967, they took over the planning areas, or regional districts were to take over planning, so that there wasn't a whole bunch of cottages and shacks and all those kind of things. And when I look at basically at that time, there was an uproar about the fact that the rural people were going to be dictated to. And now when you go out to the rural people, what they want is services. They want their utilities. They want their libraries. They want all these things. And now I look around my area in the last 6 months, we've got people coming up from the lower mainland and buying the properties and not know that they have a septic tank, and not know that they have a water system that they have to deal with, not somebody else. So over the last, I guess, 60 years, the changes in regional districts is incredible. And I think to my mind, it is just the reverse of what they started. But anyway, I think you need to have that background to begin to see where you're going with the taxes.
Thank you. Director Duty.
Thank you. I'll just keep this brief, and it's along the lines of the public consultation discussion that's been going on. And I remember when I was first on council, we had a public consultation session down at the Sandman Center, and we had 4 people show up for that evening. Now, in subsequent meetings, we've had many more than that, but I remember, mentioning to a director that it was a pretty abysmal turnout. And he said, well, that's what tends to happen. Things are kind of boring for people. They don't really want to get invested in it. And I says, I know how you can get people out here. And he says, what's that? And I says, you post that you're going to have a 10% tax increase and you'll fill this room. So the point I'm making is that you have to make it personal. It is personal to some degree, but if you actually make people understand how their pocketbook is going to be affected, they're going to want to find out why.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Ray, can you, I think you can continue now.
I'm pretty much at the end anyway. This was just basically a couple of final slides, basically making the point that we haven't been maintaining those base taxes that, the strategy that we've talked about is to maintain sort of base taxes and take advantage where we have new growth, unexpected revenues and surpluses to grow those reserves. And I'm not suggesting we would grow our reserves, immediately in one fell swoop. We'd be looking at a multi-year gradual, contributions into those reserves to restore them to a higher level. But we haven't been maintaining those base taxes. They have been decreasing year after year. And frankly, we're at a point, I can't really find any additional cost savings this year to further decrease them and offset cost increases otherwise. But I wanted to have the board be informed and understand the impact of these market forces and how they're affecting residential taxpayers in particular, because that's what the board tends to focus on when we talk about the budget. It's not whether taxes in total are going up or down. It's the impact on the residential taxpayers that tends to be looked at and taken into account. And so there's going to be some tax increase that is completely beyond my control, simply because of that shift in the tax burden as a mathematical reality of the way the system works. So I think, we need to just keep that in mind. And the idea being that, I'll try to break that out and say, if we're looking at a tax increase in 2022, how much of that would have happened anyway, even if taxes had stayed flat? And how much of that is actually a result of us increasing taxes? So that you can see those factors separately and not just one big lump change. That's really all I had.
Okay, thank you. I think Director Quinn, did you have anything further on this topic?
Yeah, just a supplementary on it. Thank you very much for that discussion. I appreciate that. And to Director Watson, don't forget there are areas in our regional district that don't have access to online stuff still. We're getting there, but we're not there yet. I think most important is we have to make the effort to get out to the people. Whether or not they take advantage of it is their decision. But we have, not only do we have to be seen to be doing it, but actually doing it. So again, thank you for that discussion. I appreciate that.
Thank you. We have a recommendation with respect to the report from Mr. Ray. No seconded. Is there any discussion, further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed, if any? I see no one opposed. That's carried. Thank you. That takes us to